Just days before Christmas in 1992, 25-year-old Christy Marak was getting ready to start her day as a teacher at a Lancaster County, Pennsylvania elementary school. She had carefully wrapped Christmas presents for her students and was about to leave her apartment, but she never made it to work that day. When Christy didn't show up for class on the morning of December 21st, 1992, her concerned principal drove to her home. There, he found a nightmare scene. Christy's front door was ajar, and she lay on her living room floor amid signs of a brutal struggle. The Christmas gifts she'd prepared for her students were scattered around her, a heartbreaking detail that underscored the cruelty of the crime. Little did anyone know at the time that the perpetrator of this vile act would be someone who was routinely let into elementary schools for decades. On that December morning, she left home wearing her winter coat and gloves, apparently headed to school, when an attacker forced their way in and overpowered her. The assault was shockingly swift and brazen, occurring roughly between 7 and 7:20 that morning, just a few minutes after Christy's roommate left for work. Police concluded the attacker struck in that narrow window and may have been watching Christy and knew her routine. They theorized that he was, in essence, stalking her and had a number of data points on her so he could orchestrate this brutal crime. Despite the violence of the crime, the perpetrator left surprisingly little forensic evidence beyond the usual biological material associated with an indecent assault. This profile was entered into the newly formed national database, but in the early 1990s those systems were extremely limited and it produced no match. Meanwhile, detectives explored every potential lead. Christy's personal life was scrutinized. She had recently broken off a relationship with an older man about 20 years her senior, known by the nickname Dagger. However, Dagger was soon cleared, and he had an airtight alibi hundreds of miles away at the time of the attack, and even volunteered a DNA sample. Despite his somewhat dark moniker, he was as helpful as he could possibly be, and he was fully cleared. Investigators also looked into other possibilities, even questioning the school principal who had found her. His intense personal concern about the situation was apparently viewed as suspicious by the investigators, which I find a bit unusual, but hey, I'm not a cop. Personally, if I found one of my employees dead, you're damn right I'd be intensely concerned about what happened to him or her. The principal appeared to have a valid alibi, having gotten to school early that morning, but the cops still had him submit a DNA test, and he was eventually completely cleared. And I know some of you are going to accuse me of Monday morning quarterbacking in the comments, but genetic tests were an arduous and expensive process in '92. Seems like a questionable use of investigative resources to me, to say the least. Witnesses recalled seeing a mysterious white car near Christy's home that morning, but at the time it wasn't enough to identify a suspect. With each suspect eliminated and every tip ending in a dead end, frustration grew. Months turned into years with no arrest, and eventually the case went cold. A breakthrough finally came more than 25 years later, thanks to persistence and a revolutionary DNA technique. In 2015, Lancaster County's District Attorney's Office took a fresh look at Christy's case and assigned a new prosecutor. This new prosecutor had been interested in her case since she was in high school when it happened 25 years previous. She pored over the old case files for months, determined to finally crack the mystery. Detectives re-examined every piece of evidence that had sat dormant. They decided to enlist outside help from Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in cutting-edge DNA analysis. Using the preserved DNA sample from the crime scene, Parabon performed a process called DNA phenotyping. This process predicts the physical traits of the unknown subject from his genetic code. However, no definitive suspect emerged from this effort. And yeah, you heard me. I just said unknown subject, like I'm on Criminal Minds here or something. In early 2018, Parabon analysts uploaded the DNA profile of the perpetrator to a public database, and it produced hits on several distant relatives of the unknown perpetrator. If you're a regular viewer of any of my channels, you already know this little process is called forensic genetic genealogy. By methodically building family trees from these matches, the genealogists zeroed in on one name that had never come up in the investigation. This was Raymond Rowe, but this guy who had caused a disturbing cold case was somewhat ironically better known to his fans as DJ Freeze. Rowe was a well-known local disc jockey, a seemingly unlikely suspect who had been hiding in plain sight in the community. And you won't believe where he was when the cops got the evidence to clap him in cuffs, but I'll come to that very shortly. In 1992, he was 24 years old and lived a few miles from Christie's home. He had no prior connection to the case and was never on investigators' radar before. But the genetic genealogy research suggested that Rowe's family tree intersected with the DNA from the crime scene, making him a strong, viable suspect. In fact, detectives later revealed that one of Rowe's relatives, his half-sister, had uploaded her DNA to a genealogy database. Presumably, she wanted to know if she could authentically wear that "Kiss Me, I'm Irish" shirt on St. Paddy's Day, or drink deeply from a beer stein. Police discreetly trailed Rowe to obtain a definitive DNA sample without tipping him off. In a weird twist, on May 31st, 2018, undercover investigators watched Rowe as he worked as a DJ at an elementary school event and managed to collect items he discarded. Two of these items were a water bottle and some chewed-up gum. The forensic lab tested these items and found that Rowe's DNA profile matched perfectly with the DNA recovered from Christy Marak's body. On June 25, 2018, nearly 26 years after Christy's slaying, police arrested 49-year-old Raymond Rowe at his Lancaster home and charged him with the crime. The news of an arrest after so many years stunned the community. Rowe had spent decades building a life as a popular local entertainer, who was even trusted to put on shows for kids. To those who knew him, it was shocking that this familiar figure, a husband and father by then, could be accused of such a heinous act. Rowe initially denied any involvement, but the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. As investigators dug deeper, they found more clues linking Rowe to the crime. Back in 1992, Rowe drove a white Toyota sedan, which matched the description of the unknown car seen by witnesses near Christie's home on the morning of the act. He also lived about 4 miles from Marak's residence, and the route between his home and workplace at the time likely took him right past her neighborhood. Facing overwhelming evidence, Rowe chose to avoid a trial. In January 2019, 27 years after the crime, he agreed to plead guilty in the first degree, and in exchange, the state agreed not to give him the big DP. He offered a brief apology to Christie's family, saying he could not imagine what pain he had caused them. Rowe, who was 50 years old at the time of his plea, stood before a judge to receive his sentence. Rowe was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 60 to 120 years for the indecent assault and related charges. This ensured that he will spend the rest of his life, plus maybe a couple more lives, behind bars. For Christie's family, the courtroom hearing was a mix of sorrow and relief. Christie's brother, Vince Marak, spoke in court about how the attack had shattered their family's sense of security and destroyed their joy for the holidays permanently. He mentioned Christmas, this time of family togetherness, would only ever be a time of mourning and sorrow for his family. One lingering mystery remains, and that's why Rowe committed this horrific crime. He never provided any motive or explanation, and prosecutors were unsure whether Rowe had known Christie or if she was chosen at random. This lack of answers has haunted Christie's family and friends, who may never learn what drove him to take her life. Personally, given the tight window of time in which he pulled off this crime, I subscribe to the theory that he was stalking Christie. Of course, ultimately, this still doesn't answer the question of why Christie was chosen for stalking to begin with, since they don't appear to have known each other. Now, I bet you think that this is where the case ends, but you'd be wrong. Even after conviction, where Rowe fully admitted to what he did, he tried to change his story. In 2021, he attempted to withdraw his guilty plea, suddenly claiming he was innocent and that someone else eliminated Christie after he left. In essence, he's now claiming that he had a consensual relationship with Christie, which, given what he openly admitted in court to doing to her, is absolutely disgusting. He even sought new DNA testing on Christie's clothing, but a judge rejected this request, calling Rowe's revised account unbelievable given the evidence. But again, there's still more to the story, and in August 2025, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned the lower court's decision. Because of this decision, there will now be additional forensic testing on Christie's clothing, and this ongoing saga continues. Despite the ongoing appeals, this former DJ remains frozen for the rest of his life in prison. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here reminding you to take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell, and also turn on all notifications. Also, there's a new feature that you might be unaware of, called Hype, which allows viewers to increase the visibility of the video, so don't forget to hit that Hype button as well. There's probably some other buttons I forgot to beg you to hit, but hey, we're running long here, and there's still more content to come. In May 1998, a foul odor in a San Francisco apartment building led to a chilling discovery. Police entered a unit in the city's Diamond Heights neighborhood on May 20th and found the decomposing body of 36-year-old Lisa Valdez on the floor. Just 4 days earlier, Lisa had been alive and well, hosting a small dinner gathering at her home for family and friends. Now she was dead, stabbed more than 20 times in a brutal attack, and her assailant had vanished without a trace. Lisa Valdez was a 36-year-old software analyst living in San Francisco's Diamond Heights district. She was known as a vibrant, outgoing person who loved to dance and cherished her friends and family. Friends described Lisa as energetic and fiercely loyal, the type who would do anything for those she loved. By all accounts, Lisa had a bright future ahead of her, a future that would be tragically cut short in the spring of 1998. The scene inside Lisa's apartment revealed the horrific violence of the crime. Her body was found lying on the bedroom floor in a state of advanced decomposition, with her legs sprawled and her shirt pulled up over her head. She had been stabbed 21 times in the upper body and face, and her hands bore defensive wounds, clear evidence that Lisa fought desperately for her life. Blood was splattered across her bedding, indicating a frenzied struggle, and tellingly, Lisa's long hair had been cut off. Investigators believed the attacker took those shorn locks as a twisted trophy, perhaps to relive the disgusting act in the future. Because of the body's condition, authorities couldn't determine if Lisa had been indecently assaulted. However, as you're about to see, the assailant lingered, perhaps for a very significant period of time, so ultimately they assumed this was one of the motivations for the crime. San Francisco police worked to piece together what happened during Lisa's final hours. The last confirmed sighting of her was on May 16th, 1998, when she hosted a dinner party at her condo for her mother and a few guests. Everything seemed normal as her mother left around midnight. Shortly after, at about 1:30 a.m. on May 17th, a neighbor heard a loud thud and the sound of someone running down the stairs. That same weekend, Lisa failed to show up for a dance class she regularly attended, an early sign that something was wrong. Disturbingly, Lisa's housekeeper unwittingly walked into the aftermath of the slaying on May 18th. Letting herself in as usual, the housekeeper very briefly saw Lisa lying on the floor and even heard a man's voice inside the apartment. Thinking she had stumbled upon a private moment between Lisa and a boyfriend, she quickly left. She wouldn't realize until later she had likely just come face to face with the perp while her employer lay dead. When the odor of decomposition grew strong 2 days later, the building manager investigated and called police, leading to the grim discovery of Lisa's body. Detectives found a few clues at the crime scene, but they raised as many questions as answers. A pair of partial fingerprints was recovered from the underside of Lisa's toilet seat, and 2 used bandages were floating in the toilet bowl. These odd items hinted that the perp might have cut himself during the attack and attempted some cleanup before fleeing. Investigators also collected blood evidence that didn't belong to Lisa. These droplets on a pillow and door frame pointed to an unknown male suspect who may have been injured in the struggle. Forensic experts extracted a DNA profile from this blood, hoping for a match in the database. But in the late 1990s, DNA testing was limited, and CODIS, the National Database of Offenders, existed, but only in a very limited form. With no database hits, investigators turned to Lisa's circle of acquaintances and did some good old-fashioned detective work. They interviewed friends, neighbors, co-workers, and recent romantic prospects, basically anyone who might have had a reason to harm her. One colleague who had a crush on Lisa and another man she had planned a first date with were both considered early on, but each offered their DNA and were cleared quickly. By the 1-year anniversary of Lisa's death, the trail had gone cold, and slowly but surely, Lisa's case slipped into the archives of the cold case files. In 2011, 13 years after the senseless act, a breakthrough finally came. One crime lab supervisor, Pam Hofsass, had never forgotten Lisa's case, and she had kept testing the evidence, hoping that new technology might one day yield a match. Her persistence paid off in September 2011, when a fresh DNA search yielded a stunning result. The DNA from the crime scene matched a profile in the now much more robust national database, giving investigators a name. The genetic evidence identified Anthony Quinn Hughes, a 52-year-old man living in San Francisco, as the responsible party. Hughes had never been on the original suspect list, though he was an old acquaintance of Lisa's from years past. At last, detectives knew who had done this to Lisa, but the question of why remained an unresolved mystery. Interestingly, Hughes had managed to avoid detection for over a decade, even though during those years he was arrested for other crimes like burglary and theft. However, despite these felony arrests, these crimes never led to his genetic information being taken and entered into CODIS. It would actually all change with an extremely minor arrest. Hughes was involved in a shoplifting incident, and the authorities took a DNA sample. I don't know what he got caught stealing, but I like to imagine it was something absurd and pointless, maybe a shopping cart full of ding-dongs and ho-hos. Armed with this genetic evidence, officers moved quickly to clap him in cuffs. They soon spotted Hughes on a city street, and according to reports, he even brazenly jaywalked in front of them, giving police an easy chance to swoop in on September 10th, 2011. After 13 long years, the suspected perpetrator was finally in custody. News of the arrest brought instant and immense relief to Lisa's family, and her sister-in-law Janet expressed gratitude that the suspect was off the streets and couldn't hurt anyone else. Once Hughes was in custody, detectives hoped to get answers about what happened to Lisa. They began a careful interrogation, at first pretending to ask about local burglaries to keep Hughes relaxed. But as soon as investigators mentioned Lisa's name, Hughes became agitated. He claimed he hadn't seen Lisa in many years and denied any role in her death. Pressed further, he admitted he had known Lisa. They had dated briefly as teenagers, but he insisted he hadn't been in contact with her since the 1980s. Crucially, he advised that he had never set foot in her apartment. Hughes had caught his foot in a judicial bear trap since he could no longer claim any innocent reason for being with Lisa in 1998. Interestingly, detectives knew there were no signs of forced entry at the condo, meaning Lisa had likely let whoever did it in. This implies she knew and trusted the person at her door, at least to some degree. When confronted with the forensic evidence, Hughes reacted in a completely unexpected way. He suddenly asked the officers for a pen and paper, as if to write down a statement. Little did the cops know, Hughes was about to confess in the most dramatic way possible. Once he had the pen in his hand, he got to work on his confession by literally repeatedly stuffing it through his neck. Stunned detectives tackled him and wrestled the pen away before this act of elimination was complete. Once he recovered, he was formally charged with Lisa Valdez's slaying. Despite being caught, Hughes offered no real explanation for his actions. Investigators theorized he may have come to Lisa's home expecting a romantic encounter, and when rejected, exploded in rage. Yet Hughes never actually formally confessed or clarified his motive, leaving the true trigger for his violence known only to him. Hughes's case took several years to reach trial. In the 4 years between his 2011 arrest and the courtroom proceedings, there were delays for a mental competency evaluation and other pretrial steps. In late 2015, Anthony Hughes finally stood trial. Prosecutors presented the DNA and fingerprint evidence, a timeline of Lisa's final night, and the story of Hughes's past connection to her. In January 2016, the jury found Hughes guilty as charged. While they initially returned a first-degree verdict, the judge reduced it to second degree at sentencing, and Hughes received a term of 16 years to life in prison. Hughes continued to protest his innocence at sentencing, insisting he had been wrongly convicted. Interestingly, Hughes appealed the conviction, arguing that the 13-year delay in charging him violated his right to a fair trial. I'm going to give you a second to guess how that little legal argument panned out. In 2018, however, a California Court of Appeal unanimously upheld the verdict, ruling that the delay was justified by the new DNA evidence linking him to the crime. As of now, Hughes continues to receive free lodging courtesy of the state, though unfortunately it appears that he'll be a free man in short order. In early December 1991, the Austin suburbs were bustling with holiday shoppers. Families crowded strip malls and couples enjoyed nights out. Hidden beneath this festive veneer, a small frozen yogurt shop in North Austin prepared to close for the evening. Two teenage employees, 17-year-old Jennifer Harbison and her friend Eliza Thomas, were tidying up while Jennifer's 15-year-old sister Sarah waited for a ride. 13-year-old Amy Ayers, another friend, was there too. None of them would make it home, and when firefighters responded to a blaze at the I Can't Believe It's Yogurt shop, they discovered a scene that would traumatize the city for decades. This incident at this Austin yogurt shop would go on to be one of the nation's most haunting unsolved mysteries until it was recently solved. But despite its recent status update, a pressing question remains, and the authorities continue to search for a second perpetrator. The evening of December 6, 1991 began like many others for the Harbison sisters. Jennifer and Eliza were wrapping up their shift when Sarah arrived, accompanied by her friend Amy. Witnesses later reported seeing men hanging around the strip mall, and a man was observed entering the shop just before closing. Shortly before midnight, a passing patrol officer noticed smoke, and when firefighters arrived, They encountered heavy flames and a pungent odor. Firefighters knew what that smell meant, though the full horror of what had happened was not yet known. As the smoke cleared, they made a gruesome discovery. 4 bodies clustered in the back storage area. Investigators determined that the girls had been bound with pieces of their own clothing, gagged with cloth, subject to illicit assault, and shot in the head with at least 2 different weapons. Their bodies had been doused with a flammable liquid and set alight. Austin police quickly launched an extensive investigation. Dozens of detectives canvassed the area, interviewed hundreds of potential witnesses, and gathered physical evidence, including 2 sets of shell casings. Unfortunately, the fire and sprinklers had destroyed much of the evidence. DNA technology was in its infancy, and investigators didn't have the tools that would later become standard. Frustration grew as leads stalled, and in the weeks following the attacks, police released composite sketches of 2 men seen near the yogurt shop. Tips poured in, leading investigators to interview a wide range of individuals, from drifters to disgruntled employees. Among those arrested was a 16-year-old named Maurice Pierce, who was found carrying a weapon at a mall 2 days after the attack. Ballistic tests eventually showed this weapon hadn't been used in the commission of the crime. However, Pierce told police he and 3 friends, Michael Scott, Robert Springsteen, and Forrest Wellborn, were all involved. Over the next few years, these 4 men, then teenagers, became the focus of the case. The investigation suffered from tunnel vision and controversial techniques, and in retrospect, the techniques appear to have been designed to get a confession rather than the truth. Detectives interrogated the suspects repeatedly, sometimes for hours without lawyers present. Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen eventually confessed, implicating each other and describing details that some investigators believed only the perpetrators would know. Critics argued the confessions were coerced, and Springsteen had developmental difficulties, and Scott had been threatened by detectives with the big state-sponsored DP. In 1999, a new investigative team revived the case, and all 4 men were arrested. Prosecutors charged Scott and Springsteen with a capital offense, while Pierce and Wellborn faced lesser charges. Springsteen was convicted in 2001 and Scott in 2002, each sentenced to life in prison. From the outset, the convictions were controversial, and defense attorneys argued that the confessions were inconsistent. They also argued that they contradicted physical evidence and were obtained under duress. Further, there was no DNA linking the men to the crime, and the weapons used in the crime were never recovered from this group. In 2006 and 2007, appellate courts reversed Springsteen's and Scott's convictions, citing improper use of co-defendants' confessions. However, the authorities were still free to bring the case against them again, given the decision on appeal. Further, DNA testing revealed that none of the 4 men were involved in the indecent assaults that took place on the victims. While this didn't necessarily mean they weren't involved, and there could have been an unknown 5th man, this made the confessions even less logically coherent. Prosecutors ultimately acknowledged they no longer had enough evidence and dropped the charges in 2009. Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen walked free after spending nearly a decade in prison. Maurice Pierce, who maintained his innocence, was eliminated by an Austin police officer during an unrelated altercation in 2010, putting an end to any questions about his role. Forrest Wellborn was never tried for his alleged role in the attack on the girls at the yogurt shop, despite having been initially charged in relation to the events. With the functional exoneration of the original suspects, the case returned to square one. Investigators continued to pursue leads, but the trail grew cold, and in 2017, the Austin cops established a team to get justice for the slain girls. However, the initial hit from this case wouldn't be from genetic genealogy, as some might have suspected, but rather from a shell casing retrieved from the scene. And full disclosure here, when I had someone in the comments tell me that this case had been solved, I immediately thought it was going to solely be due to forensic genetic genealogy. In July 2025, Detective Daniel Jackson resubmitted the casing to the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network. Advances in 3D scanning and an expanded database allowed NIBIN to find matches that earlier tests missed. When Jackson's request returned a hit, it linked the Austin casing to an unsolved 1998 double slaying in rural Kentucky. Importantly, that slaying also involved an illicit assault, and there was biological evidence left behind that irrefutably tied the perpetrator to the scene. The Kentucky case involved a very similar weapon, further raising the possibility that the same weapon had been used in Austin. The NIBIN hit was a pivotal moment, and Austin cold case detectives reached out to Kentucky investigators and shared the DNA profile they had. The two jurisdictions shared what they had, and the two profiles matched. In August 2025, a South Carolina state lab located a matching genetic profile in an unsolved 1990 slaying. The match pointed to Robert Eugene Brashers, a serial predator who had been identified through forensic genealogy in 2018. Brashers had reserved his final bullet for himself, and he voluntarily ended his own spree in 1999, leaving behind a trail of unsolved crimes. Interestingly, the ballistic testing on the weapon Brashers used in that last act would later be confirmed to be the one he had used to take some of the victims' lives at the yogurt shop. On September 29, 2025, Austin police held a press conference to announce that they had finally solved the yogurt shop case. Robert Eugene Brashers was born in 1956 and spent much of his life drifting across the American South. He had a history of violence, indecent assaults, and burglary, and was known for his extreme violence. In 1985, he shot his neighbor during a dispute in Alabama, and later, he was linked to several unsolved slayings. As of right now, he is confirmed to have slain at least 7 people, and is believed to be responsible for many other crimes as well. In January 1999, Brashers was arrested in Missouri for unlawful possession of a weapon and was suspected of kidnapping. He was released on bond and fled, but the U.S. Marshals successfully tracked him to a motel in Kennett, Missouri. It was there, during a last stand, that he chose to give himself the DP in that hotel room. Although investigators have identified Robert Brashers as the main perpetrator, questions remain. Police have hinted that at least 2 men committed the crime, because 2 different weapons were used, and witnesses reported seeing more than 1 man near the shop. Brashers may have worked with an accomplice who remains unknown. Some believe that Brashers met the accomplice in the months before the crime. He had previously been stopped by Border Patrol near Del Rio, Texas, just 2 days after the attacks while traveling with an unidentified male. The man's identity has never been confirmed, and it's unclear if there was a DNA profile from the man recovered from the scene. Another question revolves around why Brashers targeted the yogurt shop. Unlike his other crimes, which involved break-ins at private homes, the yogurt shop was a high-risk public space. Some speculate that Brashers and his accomplice intended to rob the shop and then encountered the girls. Others think that the girls were the primary targets, perhaps after being stalked. Brashers has a history of disturbing and illicit violence even outside of this, so it's possible that he may have linked up with another serial predator. Further, the speculation that there may have been more than one offender is supported by logistic considerations. Controlling 4 victims, binding them, and carrying out the horrible acts would have been significantly more difficult for a single person than for 2 men. Personally, I don't find this point to be all that compelling, and I suspect 4 teenage girls who are confronted by one armed man wouldn't be fighting back in any meaningful way. In fact, I suspect this would likely be the case even if these were 4 unarmed, burly, adult males. The full or partial resolution of the yogurt shop slayings illustrates just how far forensic technology has come in the last few decades. Had this crime taken place today, the perpetrator or perpetrators would have been clapped in cuffs within months, given the power of these testing techniques. But perhaps more poignantly, it's unlikely that the 4 innocent victims would have ever met this end at all. Brashers likely wouldn't have been given the opportunity to start his crime spree if he lived in the era of ultra-modern forensic techniques. Anyway, it looks like there's still some significant work to be done on this case by investigators. While it hasn't yet been confirmed that a second perpetrator exists, I hope to have an update on this case shortly. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here reminding you to take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell, and also turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget to hit that hype button as well, since it increases the visibility of my content in the algorithm as well. On a humid July day in 1998, the peace of Strasburg, Virginia was shattered by a crime that would haunt the Shenandoah Valley for decades. A young mother was stabbed in her apartment, and her 10-week-old daughter vanished without a trace. In 2025, the alleged perpetrator, Daniel Pompel, would be arrested. But despite this arrest, one massive question remains outstanding. On July 27, 1998, 20-year-old Silena Jo Dalton failed to show up for her shift at a local fast food restaurant. Worried, one of her co-workers went to her second-floor apartment on South Charles Street in Strasburg. The friend knew something was wrong when she saw Dalton's black convertible parked outside with the top down. Inside, she discovered Dalton's body on the living room couch. She had been stabbed repeatedly while sleeping, and appeared to have been deceased for hours. Dalton's 10-week-old daughter, Allison, was nowhere to be found, and several baby bottles were missing. Investigators arrived quickly, launching a search for the infant and collecting evidence in what was now both a slaying and a suspected abduction. The medical examiner determined that Silena had been stabbed 5 times. Based on the condition of the body, investigators estimated that she had perished between 9:15 and 10:30 that morning, a relatively narrow window for the crime to have occurred. Neighbors later told police they had not heard screams, but one person reported seeing a man placing a baby into the passenger side of a truck around 9 o'clock. Another witness recalled hearing a disturbance that morning and seeing a man leaving the apartment with a bundle under his arm. This witness wasn't quite sure what the bundle was and couldn't say if it was a baby or just a jacket. At the time of her death, Silena Dalton was in the process of getting paternal DNA tests to establish her boyfriend, Daniel Pompel, as Allison's father. She was also pursuing child support payments against him. Pompel acknowledged visiting Silena that morning, and he claimed he knocked on the door and left when no one answered. He maintained that he had nothing to do with the attack or the disappearance. Early searches of his home yielded no evidence, and sources report that he was cooperative at the time. Silena's mother, who suddenly found herself raising her daughter's other child and caring for Silena's memory, was not content to sit idly by. In 2000, she filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Pompel seeking $1.5 million in damages. The purpose wasn't the money, but rather, she hoped the civil action would unearth new information or force Pompel to answer questions publicly. However, without hard evidence linking him to the crime, the suit was dismissed for lack of proof before it even got to the discovery stage where he could be questioned. Family and friends remained convinced of Pompel's involvement, but there was little more they could do. In the years that followed, the Dalton case faded from the headlines and the case went cold. In 2017, investigators expressed hope that modern DNA techniques would uncover new leads. However, the technology just wasn't there at that point. Investigators carefully preserved evidence from the crime scene, including a red mechanic's rag found near Silena's body. At the time, they believed the rag may have been used to muffle her screams. In 2025, as part of a renewed cold case initiative supported by the Virginia Attorney General's Office and federal grants, police obtained a search warrant for Pompel's DNA. Pompel had refused to voluntarily provide a DNA sample when investigators approached him a few years earlier. After executing the warrant, forensic analysts compared his DNA with the biological material found on the rag. Court documents allege that the rag contained both Silena's DNA and Pompel's DNA, supporting the theory that it was used during the commission of the crime. On September 27, 2025, the Virginia State Police announced the arrest of 56-year-old Daniel Pompel on a charge of first-degree slaying. He was taken into custody in Culpeper County, where he lived. According to court documents, the arrest was based primarily on the DNA link between Pompel and the red rag. Court documents suggest the rag was identical to red mechanic's rags found in Pompel's home, and that his biological evidence was all over the rag. Notably, despite his apparent cooperation in the investigation back in the 90s, the authorities have gone on the record saying that he never asked about his missing daughter. Many have interpreted this as cause for significant concern about her whereabouts, but for reasons that I'm about to get into, I think there's a glimmer of hope here. While the arrest marked a major development, many questions remain. Most importantly, Allison Dalton has not been found, and if she is still alive, she would be 27 years old today. Age progression images released in 2017 show a young woman with brown hair and eyes, reflecting the baby's features. Investigators continue to work under the assumption that the person who ended the life of her mom also abducted Allison. Since Pompel's arrest is for the slaying only, the abduction remains an open case. Genetic genealogy has the potential to be the tool that finally sheds light on what happened to Allison. While traditional DNA comparisons rely on direct matches to known individuals, genetic genealogy takes the process a step further by building family trees from partial genetic links. If investigators can recover a viable DNA sample from any item connected to Allison, it could be cross-referenced against vast genealogical databases. In this case, if Allison survived, it's almost certain that she was abandoned somewhere where she could be found and be subsequently adopted. Adoption complicates genetic genealogy because it often severs the paper trail between biological and legal families. Records may be sealed, altered, or inaccessible, making it harder to connect DNA matches to the correct lineage. As such, this approach would likely require her own DNA to be present in a database, since nobody who matches to her will know who she is. One reason I speculate that Allison could still be alive is the lack of any remains ever being found, despite extensive searches. Infants can be hidden or relocated much more easily than older children. If she was taken by someone, like for instance her father potentially, she may have been subsequently passed off and grown up without ever realizing her true origins. There have been numerous cases where stolen infants survive into adulthood under assumed identities, living what appear to be ordinary lives. For instance, there's a practice going back to the Middle Ages known as a baby box, where churches will offer a place to leave a baby anonymously. This is generally believed to be to keep the babies from being abandoned and succumbing to exposure. But first, let's discuss the motive for a second, because I also think this bolsters the possibility that Allison is alive. Police have suggested that financial pressure may have played a role as Silena sought child support, and Pompel expressed frustration at the prospect of paying. It's also possible that the attack stemmed from a confrontation over the paternity test. If Pompel did it, by abandoning Allison somewhere safe, he wouldn't have had to pay the support he so despised. Further yet, whoever took the baby also took baby bottles along with him, which indicates that the person in question intended to keep the infant alive. Notably, he could have sold the baby through a black market baby ring as well. At present, Pompel continues to maintain his innocence and await trial. If Pompel did it, and if Allison is still alive, it would appear that he has substantial leverage to cut a deal to solve her case as well. A pregnant young woman vanished from Indianapolis around Thanksgiving 1984, leaving behind a small son and an anxious family. 6 weeks later, a turkey hunter discovered the bound and strangled body of a red-haired woman off Interstate 75 near Jellicoe, Tennessee. The victim had been wrapped in a blanket with duct tape and dumped over a guardrail, and she had no identification. For more than 3 decades, she would remain the Campbell County Jane Doe, one of several female victims with reddish hair found along southern highways in the early 1980s. This mystery persisted until advances in DNA technology and a renewed push by investigators finally unraveled the secrets behind the tragedy of Tina Farmer. Friends last saw Tina on Thanksgiving Day 1984, and family members reported her missing not long afterward. Her sister later contacted Indianapolis police again in 1992, emphasizing that the family still had no answers. It's unclear what actual steps were taken to investigate her disappearance at that time, although there were rumors that she might have left town voluntarily or gotten involved in illicit work. Nothing concrete surfaced. Tina was arrested in 1983, though none of the sources indicate what this arrest was for. She was fingerprinted as part of this process. However, given that there was speculation that she was involved in adult work, it's been speculated that this arrest may have been related to that. Notably, unbeknownst to her relatives, Tina was also about 2 months pregnant when she disappeared. On January 1st, 1985, a passerby noticed a body lying below a guardrail near Jellicoe on Interstate 75 in Campbell County, Tennessee. The victim was partially undressed, bound with strips of a t-shirt and gagged, and a blanket with duct tape was wrapped around her. The autopsy determined she had been strangled and had been dead for several days. Authorities couldn't match her to any missing person report, so they classified her as an unidentified victim and retained her fingerprints and a few items of evidence. The case soon became associated with several similar slayings in the region. Between 1978 and 1985, the bodies of at least 6 women with red or reddish hair were found along interstates in Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, and West Virginia. Many were strangled and dumped with blankets or a variety of other makeshift coverings, and there began to be whispers of a serial predator on the loose. Media outlets dubbed these events the Redhead Slayings, and a multi-state task force formed in 1985 to share information and look for links. At the time, investigators speculated that a long-haul trucker could be targeting vulnerable women along highways. However, forensic science in the mid-1980s relied largely on blood typing and limited fingerprint databases, leaving authorities with few concrete leads. As months turned into years, the Campbell County Jane Doe case went cold. While the Jane Doe case languished, another disturbing incident offered a glimpse into the perpetrator's possible identity. However, the technology at the time just wasn't there yet, even if investigators suspected something more was at play. In March 1985, a Knoxville dancer known as Tasha met a truck driver named Jerry Leon Johns at a club. The appropriately named Johns offered to pay her for more action and drove her to a motel. And yeah, seriously, if this isn't nominative determinism at work, I don't know what is. When she tried to leave, he forced her into her car, tied her hands and feet with strips of her t-shirt, gagged her, and drove west on Interstate 40. He told her he was going to eliminate her and became angry when he discovered she dyed her hair rather than being a natural redhead. After parking in a wooded area, Johns wrapped a strip of cloth around her neck and strangled her until she lost consciousness. She was dumped into a drainage basin and was left there, with Johns presumably believing that he had just taken a life. Miraculously, she survived, crawled to the highway, and flagged down a helpful trucker who saved her life. Her description enabled police to quickly arrest Johns, who had also stolen Tasha's vehicle. Johns would be convicted in 1987, and the authorities speculated that based on his conduct, this wasn't his first rodeo, but they couldn't prove anything. In 2016, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation resubmitted the blanket and clothing found with the Jane Doe for modern testing. This time, analysts detected a biological find that couldn't previously be seen and developed a genetic profile. If you've been following this story up until this point, you may have guessed that Jerry Johns was the man who would be the match. The breakthrough meant that Johns had been with the victim and was likely the one who had slain her. However, the victim was still a Jane Doe, and it wouldn't be for another 2 years that the identity of Tina McKinney Farmer and the Campbell County Jane Doe were linked up. An intrepid TBI detective ended up searching through the records and finding that Tina's case linked with the Campbell County Jane Doe in a lot of ways. Fortunately, Tina was arrested in 1983, so her fingerprints were on record, and the fingerprints of the Jane Doe had been taken intact. This was absolute confirmation that the Campbell Doe was Tina. Armed with the DNA match and the victim's identity, TBI investigators presented their findings to a Campbell County grand jury in late 2019. The panel concluded that Jerry Johns would have been indicted for a first-degree charge if he were still alive. For better or for worse, Johns had perished in prison in 2015 at age 67 and will never face justice for his actions. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here reminding you to take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell, and also turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget to hit that hype button and hype this video up, since it allows the video to be more visible both to new viewers and to subscribers who haven't hit the bell. The discovery of thousands of human bone fragments strewn across an Indiana estate in the mid-1990s sounded like something out of a horror movie. Yet it was reality for the families of several missing men. Among those fragments were the remains of Daniel Halloran, a 22-year-old father from Colorado. Halloran vanished in 1993 without a missing person report and became one of the victims attributed to an Indiana property owner named Herb Baumeister. For decades, the bones collected from the property sat unidentified while families waited for answers. Only in 2025 did new forensic techniques allow Halloran's loved ones to finally learn what happened to him. Daniel Halloran was born on May 10, 1972, and grew up primarily in Colorado. As a young adult, he worked odd jobs and traveled back and forth between Colorado and Indiana. According to his daughter Coral, he had a tumultuous relationship with her mother, and by 1993, the couple's relationship had deteriorated. That year, when Coral was almost 2 years old, Halloran returned to Indiana and he never came back. And within a short time, his communication stopped entirely. Because he lived somewhat itinerantly and had few bills or records, his disappearance wasn't reported to authorities at the time. Coral's mother hired private investigators and even reached out to social services, but there were no matches in missing person databases. For Coral, The lack of information led to conflicting emotions, and she wondered if her father had abandoned her family or if something more sinister had happened. Her aunt eventually suggested contacting the coroner's office since it became clear that Danny had simply dropped off the face of the earth, but that too led to nothing at the time. When Halloran vanished, local news in Indiana had begun to focus on a series of disappearances among gay men in their 20s and early 30s. Investigators suspected that a predator was targeting men at bars in Indianapolis, strangling them and dumping their bodies. Suspicion eventually fell on an outwardly successful businessman named Herb Baumeister. Baumeister owned a chain of thrift stores and lived on an 18-acre estate called Fox Hollow Farm in Westfield, Indiana. In August 1995, police received a call from a man who claimed that someone named Brian Smart had taken him to a house with an indoor pool and attempted to strangle him with a hose. The man escaped, but another victim later identified his attacker as Baumeister. Detectives went to his wife and asked for permission to search Fox Hollow Farm, a request which she granted. Her son had previously found what appeared to be human remains on the property, but Baumeister played it off like it was no big deal. Clearly, Herb's wife harbored significant suspicions, though, so when the police came knocking, she wanted answers too. What investigators found shocked them. Scattered across the wooded property were more than 10,000 bones and bone fragments. The remains belonged to at least 11 people, though many bones were charred and crushed, making identification difficult. Some victims were only partial skeletons, and bone fragments showed evidence of burning. Because many of the missing men frequented gay bars, investigators theorized that Baumeister targeted gay or bisexual men, luring them to his estate under the pretense of good times. With the evidence mounting, authorities issued a warrant for Baumeister's arrest. Instead of surrendering, he fled to Canada and went deep into a provincial park in Ontario, where he finally ended his disturbing spree. In his note, he talked about failing businesses and marriage troubles, but didn't confess to anything. Daniel Halloran wasn't openly gay and didn't fit the stereotypes investigators initially associated with Baumeister's victims. He may have frequented bars or social circles that overlapped with Baumeister's hunting grounds. Halloran was described by friends as adventurous and sometimes impulsive, and after moving back to Indiana in 1993, he was seen around Indianapolis's nightlife scene. Investigators believe that sometime after March 1994, he encountered Baumeister and accepted an invitation to Fox Hollow Farm. Some believe he may have been lured there with the promise of illicit substances, rather than for other forms of action. Once there, Baumeister eliminated him, though the reasons for this remain a mystery, much like all of his crimes. For decades, Halloran's remains would be cataloged but ultimately unidentified. One obstacle to identifying Halloran's remains was that both of his parents and his brother were deceased. However, investigators discovered that his mother's DNA had been collected after she perished from an overdose. The authorities extracted a DNA profile from bone fragments recovered at Fox Hollow Farm and compared it with the sample from Halloran's mother. Coral Halloran, Daniel's daughter, would end up providing her own sample to confirm the match with absolute certainty. For Coral Halloran, learning the fate of her father brought mixed emotions. Growing up, she wrestled with uncertainty, at times thinking her father might have chosen to disappear. Coral went on record saying that she felt a combination of grief and relief upon finding out the fate of her father. However, she was of course sickened to learn how Baumeister eliminated him on Fox Hollow Farm. As of 2025, 3 DNA profiles from Fox Hollow Farm remain unmatched. Hamilton County authorities continue to work with private companies, state labs, and the University of Indianapolis to identify those individuals. Ultimately, But for advances in forensic technology, Daniel Halloran's disappearance would have likely remained an unsolved mystery for all time. Halloran vanished in 1993, and like many of Herb Baumeister's suspected victims, left behind no missing person report or paper trail. The mystery began on an ordinary June day in 2014 when highway workers along a rural road near Geneva, Wisconsin, spotted two weathered suitcases abandoned near a guardrail. When they inspected one of them to see if it contained trash, they discovered something far more chilling: decomposing human remains. They immediately alerted the authorities and didn't dare investigate any further. The second suitcase, dragged from the ditch by deputies, held another body. The gruesome scene immediately drew national attention, and investigators began piecing together how the victims ended up folded inside luggage and left beside a highway. The search for answers would span states, draw in forensic specialists, and reveal a crime committed by a man who once wore a police badge. Jenny Games was born in the early 1990s and grew up mostly in the Oregon foster care system. Accounts from her foster family describe her as an optimistic young woman trying to build a stable life despite a turbulent childhood. In August 2012, she left the home of her foster father in Cottage Grove, Oregon, telling relatives she was going to visit friends. She was 19 at the time and starting to navigate adulthood, so her foster family didn't immediately report her missing. She had been somewhat estranged from them for a while, so her disappearance didn't initially trigger alarm, and there was no missing person case for investigators to consult. It would take almost 2 years for authorities to determine what happened after she left Oregon, in part because her remains were severely decomposed when discovered. During this time, her uncanny forensic reconstruction would go viral across the internet and traditional media outlets, leading to substantially more attention than usual on her case. Jenny's path tragically crossed with that of Steven Zellick, a former Wisconsin police officer. Zellick had resigned from the police force years earlier after allegations that he harassed and stalked women while on duty. He continued to frequent websites under aliases such as Mr. Handcuffs, trolling for women interested in extremely rough activity. Investigators later learned that Jenny interacted with Zellick on one of these sites and agreed to meet him in person. In late 2012, Jenny flew from Oregon to Wisconsin, and Zellick met her at the Milwaukee airport and drove her to a hotel in Kenosha County. According to the criminal complaint, the two spent several days together engaging in what I will euphemistically call a choking game. On the last day, Zellick later claimed he lost control, and instead of seeking help, he placed her body in a suitcase. For months, he stored the suitcase, first in his refrigerator and later in the trunk of his car, while he continued to work as a security guard. Zellick's pattern of meeting women on websites would repeat, and in November 2013, he lured 37-year-old Laura Simonson, a mother of 7 from Minnesota, to a hotel in Rochester. He claims that he again lost control during a quote-unquote choking game and then accidentally slew her as well. In June 2014, he drove to rural Walworth County and dumped both suitcases off the side of the road, believing nobody would find them. Notably, the forensic reconstruction of Jenny, which ended up going viral for its supposed poor quality, ended up being the thing that would give her back her name. Since Jenny's reconstruction was seen by so many people who knew her and knew she was missing, saw her exaggerated facial features, and knew it was her. From there, dental records provided the final key to unlocking Jenny's identity, and investigators received dental information from her dentist. They compared it to the remains, and the match confirmed the victim was the missing 19-year-old from Oregon. With the victims identified, investigators traced their last communications. Laura Simonson's missing person case had pointed to a man she planned to meet at a motel. Some of her friends were aware that the man she was going to meet went by the online handle Mr. Handcuffs, which gave investigators an evidentiary thread to tug on. Detectives subpoenaed records from quote-unquote dating websites and found that the same username had contacted Jenny and Laura. The information provided eventually led to Stephen Zellick's West Allis apartment. Police obtained a search warrant and immediately arrested him on 2 counts of hiding a corpse. During his interrogation, he claimed the deaths of the women were accidental, but the physical evidence contradicted these claims. Zellick had already purchased materials to hide the bodies, including suitcases and padlocks, and had taken steps to keep the bodies hidden for months. Prosecutors argued that his behavior suggested premeditation rather than panic. The legal proceedings lasted several years and spanned 2 states. In Wisconsin, Zellick initially faced a first-degree intentional slaying charge, which carries a mandatory life sentence. He eventually reached a plea agreement with prosecutors. In January 2016, he pleaded guilty to a reduced count of first-degree reckless slaying and an additional charge of hiding a corpse. During the plea hearing, he again claimed he and Jenny consensually engaged in everything, and it was all just a big accident that happened twice. The judge sentenced Zellick to 35 years in prison for Jenny's slaying and 5 years for concealing her corpse, and from there, he was shipped off to Minnesota to face further justice. In Minnesota, Zellick pleaded guilty in 2017 to a second-degree count in Laura Simonson's case. A judge there imposed a 25-year sentence, and for some reason, the Minnesota sentence will run concurrently with the Wisconsin term. Notably, Zellick has attempted to appeal his convictions, arguing that he had ineffective counsel, though as of yet, this hasn't gone anywhere, and this former cop remains locked up. As of now, I would hope that the authorities are going back through his records from his time as a cop and seeing if he was involved in any unusual incidents during his tenure. Late on February 20th, 2010, a frigid winter night in North Carolina, 16-year-old Michael Scott Rogers made a frantic phone call to his mother. He was lost, hurt, and terrified, sobbing that he'd been beaten and didn't know where he was. He pleaded for help, crying that they might end his life if he wasn't found soon. Unlike many cases with calls like this wasn't a mental breakdown or the result of substance abuse. Michael's words reflected reality completely. His panicked mother, Barbara Leonard, called 911 and raced through the dark, winding rural roads to find him. For Barbara, it was a living nightmare. By the next day, Michael's body would be discovered in a muddy field, shirtless and lifeless, after a night of teenage partying ended in tragedy. This is the story of that tragic February 2010 night, and how a supposedly fun gathering went deadly, and how investigators uncovered the truth to bring justice for Michael. On February 20th, 2010, Michael, a high school sophomore who had turned 16 just 3 months earlier, left his home in Brevard, North Carolina. He was going to attend a house party in the nearby community of Horseshoe, as teenagers often do. The host was 19-year-old Scott Fisher, who invited friends over while his parents were out of town. According to court records, alcohol flowed freely, and some guests used a variety of drugs, creating a wild atmosphere. Michael, just 16 and not used to such chaos, reportedly became belligerent after drinking. Tensions quickly escalated. Importantly, the source on Michael acting belligerently comes from people who were involved in this horrific incident to one extent or another, so take that with a grain of salt. He got into a scuffle with 20-year-old Richard Thomas, leaving Michael injured on the floor. Michael got up, dusted himself off, and prepared to leave. This isn't exactly an uncommon occurrence for a teenager who is unfamiliar with drinking, and of course that should have been the end of it. But then Scott Fisher, worried that Michael would have called the cops after he left, decided to do something that would fully change the course of the night. Scott, who was on probation and panicking at the thought of police, punched the already injured Michael to the floor and hit him several more times while he was down. Personally, I don't see how this was supposed to reduce the risk of police involvement in any way whatsoever, which leads me to question the entire narrative. What started as a night of fun had exploded into violence, leaving Michael badly injured and bleeding. Many partygoers fled as soon as they realized the police might be coming, leaving only a few people with Michael. Despite his injuries, Michael managed to pull out his cell phone around 11 and call home for help. When his mother answered, she heard her son slurring and begging to be picked up. Minutes later, he called back in tears, saying he was hurt, bleeding, and lost, and that he feared the people who beat him might return to finish the job. An arrangement was made for Michael to be picked up at a nearby church on King Road. Michael's family rushed toward that location, calling 911 on the way. Meanwhile, a concerned neighbor, who happened to be Scott's great-uncle Keith, arrived around 11:30 p.m. to break up the remainder of the party after hearing the commotion. He found Michael injured and semi-conscious on the floor and insisted the others not leave him behind. So Scott and a few others carried Michael outside and loaded him into a silver Volkswagen Passat to drive him to the church meeting point. However, as they drove, Michael suddenly panicked and started swinging at the driver and passengers in a confused rage. Again, I'll emphasize that this is according to court records, and again, I'll say that this is based upon the testimony of the people in the vehicle. Instead of calming him, Scott decided to change plans. He directed the driver to a secluded boat ramp by the French Broad River, hoping to avoid the cops on the main road. There, they dragged Michael out of the car and left him on the ground without aid. Michael had somehow lost his shirt during the chaos, so he was now out in the 20-degree cold without any proper protection, and keep this in mind, because it's gonna matter. Scott and his companions then sped off, abandoning the 16-year-old alone in the dark. Michael managed one final call to his mother from that remote spot, but he couldn't say exactly where he was. It was too late, and by the time Barbara and the deputies reached the church, Michael was nowhere to be found. They searched the area in vain as Michael disappeared into the freezing night. Authorities soon learned about the party and suspected foul play. At the Fisher house, officers found blood droplets in a bloody towel, confirming Michael had been injured there. Scott's father, Sean Fisher, was contacted by phone and promised to find out from his son what happened. When Sean reached Scott, the young man first claimed he had left Michael at the end of the driveway on King Road. Police found nothing there and pressed him for more. Scott then suggested Michael might be with a girl named Ashley at an apartment in Brevard. It sounded unlikely, but it was the only lead, and what happened next is very bizarre, but it's confirmed by court records. Around 3 that morning, officers went to Ashley's apartment and found Scott, Richard Thomas, and others hiding out there. It's unclear why Scott suggested that Michael may be with Ashley, given that's where he was hanging out. Outside was Ashley's silver Passat, stained with blood and missing a taillight. Confronted with this evidence, Scott and Richard admitted they had driven Michael from the party and left him near a bridge by the river after he became aggressive. They claim Michael walked off into the darkness and they hadn't seen him since. With this information, police focused their search on the remote area by the French Broad River. They discovered shards of a broken taillight and drops of blood at a gravel pull-off by a boat ramp, confirming they were in the right spot. Investigators even noticed an oil slick on the ground that matched an oil leak from Ashley's Volkswagen, further tying the vehicle to the scene. Finally, just before 11 on the morning of February 21st, An officer scanning the surroundings spotted Michael's body about 100 yards from the boat access in a muddy field. It appeared Michael had wandered roughly that far from where he'd been left before collapsing in the pasture. He was lying on his back, barefoot and shirtless, and was already deceased. The field was used to pasture pigs, but a guard dog had thankfully kept the animals away from Michael's body. If the pigs had gotten access to his body, it's likely that most of the evidence of the crime would have been destroyed. Given how the only conviction in this case would occur, this guard dog was a confirmed good boy, since without the dog, there would be no conviction. I'm also going to take a moment to point out here how unusual it was that Michael's body ended up where it did, given what pigs are known to do to bodies. An autopsy later confirmed that Michael died of hypothermia. Essentially, he froze to death after spending hours injured in the bitter cold. His body bore numerous bruises and scrapes from the beatings, but none of those injuries were fatal on their own. In other words, had he received timely help, he almost certainly would have survived. Toxicology tests also showed Michael had been drinking, though this wasn't directly a factor in his demise. Notably, these tests also proved that he hadn't consumed any other substances that night. Disturbingly, the immediate cause of death was being left exposed to the elements while incapacitated. Faced with the evidence, Scott Fisher eventually confessed to his role. He admitted that after the fight, he and his friends drove Michael out to the country and abandoned him there when he wouldn't calm down. Court documents indicate that he even bragged later to a friend that he had beaten up Michael, though this was before he learned that Michael had perished. Despite this, nearly a year passed with no arrests, but Michael's family never stopped pushing for accountability. In January 2011, a Henderson County grand jury finally indicted Scott Fisher on an involuntary manslaughter charge for Michael's death. The case went to trial in May 2012. Michael's mother testified through tears about his final phone calls, and investigators laid out the grim sequence of events. Somewhat unsurprisingly, the jury convicted Scott of involuntary manslaughter after only a few hours of deliberation. Scott Fisher, then 21, was sentenced to 19 to 23 months in prison for causing Michael's death. To the family, it felt like a paltry punishment for the loss of a child, but it was the maximum allowed under the charge. Scott appealed the conviction, but in 2013, the North Carolina Court of Appeals upheld the verdict, finding no error in his trial. Notably, no one else has ever faced justice for their alleged roles in this crime. On April 26, 1993, a janitor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks opened a dormitory bathroom door and stumbled upon a horrifying scene. Inside that washroom lay the body of 20-year-old Sophie Sergi, a former student who had been visiting campus. Sophie Sergi was a bright young woman from the small Yukon River village of Pitkas Point in western Alaska. She had been studying marine biology on a scholarship, but took a semester off to work back home and save money for orthodontic treatment. In late April 1993, Sophie returned to Fairbanks for an orthodontist appointment and stayed overnight with a friend in Bartlett Hall, a dorm on campus. Just past midnight, Sophie stepped out for a smoke, telling her friend she'd be right back. Tragically, she never returned. The next day, Sophie's body was found in a second-floor bathroom of Bartlett Hall, brutally attacked and shot at close range. The brazen slaying had occurred just feet away from where other students slept and showered, a shock that left the campus community terrified and on edge. Investigators interviewed dozens of students, including 18-year-old freshman Stephen Downs, who lived upstairs in the dorm. Downs and others denied knowing anything, and no solid leads emerged. Detectives collected DNA evidence from Sophie's body, and by 2000, they had a profile of the unknown perpetrator. but it got no hits in CODIS. For years, Alaska State Troopers continued chasing the case. They followed dozens of tips and even collected DNA samples from numerous potential suspects, but none matched the crime scene evidence. In 2010, a cold case detective took a fresh look and re-interviewed Downs' old roommate. That's when a telling detail emerged. The roommate revealed that back in 1993, Downs kept a gun in their dorm room. Notably, this was the same caliber weapon that had fired the bullet recovered next to Sophie's body. It was a tantalizing clue, but without a DNA link or confession, it wasn't enough to crack the case. In mid-2018, cold case detectives partnered with a private lab to run Sophie's crime scene DNA through a public genealogy database. Before long, there was a hit. Not an exact match, but a partial match to a woman who turned out to be a second-degree relative of the suspect. Further forensic research led right back to Steve Downs, the same man who had briefly been considered by the initial investigators. Armed with their new lead, Alaska State Troopers and Maine Police, where Downs now lived, began surveilling their new prime suspect. He was now 44 years old, and in an extremely disturbing twist, he was working as a nurse in Maine by this time. Investigators approached him and obtained a DNA sample from him via a search warrant in early 2019. The sample was rushed to the lab, and the result came back conclusive. Stephen Downs' DNA profile exactly matched the biological material on Sophie's body. On February 15, 2019, nearly 26 years after Sophie's death, authorities finally moved to make an arrest. With the help of local officers, they took Downs into custody at his workplace in Auburn, Maine, catching him completely off guard. Downs, for his part, insisted he had nothing to do with the crime. When questioned by police, he admitted he remembered the case, but claimed he didn't know Sophie. Interestingly, this admission that he didn't know Sophie would hamper his future potential defense as to why his biological material was on her body. He then went on to speculate that it was soldiers from a nearby base who likely committed the act in a failed attempt to deflect responsibility. Unsurprisingly, the authorities didn't take his theory too seriously, and within days, Downs was extradited over 4,000 miles from Maine back to Alaska to face justice. The case finally went to trial in early 2022 in Fairbanks, after nearly 3 decades of uncertainty. Nearly 29 years after Sophie's death, a jury found Stephen Downs guilty as charged. In September 2022, Downs was sentenced to 75 years in prison, effectively a life term for the now 47-year-old man. The judge noted that Downs had shown a callous disregard for Sophie's life, robbing her of her future and her family of their beloved daughter. For Sophie's family and the Fairbanks community, the verdict brought a very long-awaited sense of relief and closure. Notably, it was also the first case in Alaska where this new forensic technology was used in court, marking a historic milestone. Unfortunately, Alaska also has a much broader problem with violence against Indigenous women, and hopefully, genetic genealogy can be used to crack more of these cases. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here reminding you to subscribe and hit the notification bell and turn on all those notifications. Also, if you feel like tossing a ducat in my bucket, check out the membership option by clicking join, or hit the Patreon link in the description. With that said, we've still got more to go, so let's get back to business. In February 1984, the lifeless body of 21-year-old Mary Jane Thompson was discovered behind a warehouse along Dallas's Irving Boulevard. Yet as years turned into decades, Thompson's attacker remained unidentified and free, and her case went cold. Nearly 38 years later, however, a breakthrough in DNA technology finally put a name and face to the man who had escaped justice for so long. Mary Jane Thompson had moved to Dallas about 6 months before her death, hoping to launch a modeling career in the big city. She worked 2 jobs, one at a florist shop and another at a local restaurant, to make ends meet while chasing her dreams. Before relocating to Dallas, Thompson had lived in Houston and Los Angeles, where she had also tried to break through in modeling. Friends and family knew her as an ambitious young woman with a bright future. But in the winter of 1984, Mary Jane's ambitions were tragically cut short. On the evening of February 11th, 1984, Thompson was last seen taking a bus to the Trinity Medical Clinic on Industrial Boulevard in Dallas. She had planned to visit the clinic, but when she arrived, she found it closed for the day. What happened next remains a nightmare scenario, and Mary Jane never made it back home. 2 days later, on February 13th, her body was discovered near out-of-use railroad tracks behind a warehouse in the city's Stemmons Corridor industrial area. She had been brutally attacked, subjected to the most indecent assault, and strangled with her own leg warmers. Dallas police launched an investigation into the young woman's slaying, interviewing witnesses and examining evidence. However, in 1984, forensic science was limited. DNA profiling wasn't yet a standard tool, so detectives had few leads to work with. That said, the authorities had enough forethought to make sure they fully secured the biological evidence they were able to recover for later testing. Despite their efforts, no suspect was identified at the time, and Mary Jane Thompson's case began to go cold. For years, Thompson's family lived with the painful knowledge that this predator was still out there. Investigators never forgot Mary Jane's case, even as it languished without answers. Cold case detectives periodically reviewed the evidence, hoping new information or techniques might crack the mystery. But through the late 1980s and 1990s, the file remained unsolved. In 2009, a quarter century after the slaying, the Dallas Police Department decided to fully reopen the Thompson case and re-examine the evidence. By then, DNA analysis had become a powerful investigative tool. Detectives submitted swabs from Mary Jane's 1984 autopsy for modern DNA testing. The lab results revealed a genetic profile belonging to an unknown male suspect, presumably the man who had assaulted and slain her. However, when investigators ran that male profile through law enforcement databases, no match was found. The profile didn't correspond to any convicted offender or known person in the National DNA Index, leaving the suspect's identity a mystery. With no name to go with the DNA and no other strong leads, the case went cold once again. By 2018, advances in DNA technology and investigative techniques led Dallas authorities to take yet another look at Mary Jane's cold case. They looked into the possibility of using forensic genetic genealogy to crack the case. However, at the time, the technology was extremely new. Unfortunately, without the proper resources allocated, no new breakthroughs came at this time, but that would all change shortly. In 2020, the FBI joined the effort, bringing those much-needed additional resources to the case, and a full genealogical manhunt began. Using this cutting-edge approach, investigators in Mary Jane's case finally got the lead they desperately needed. The DNA trail led to a man named Edward Morgan, a Dallas resident who would have been in his early 20s at the time of the 1984 slaying. Once Edward Morgan was identified through genealogical sleuthing, detectives moved quickly to confirm their suspicions. In early 2022, they obtained a direct DNA sample from Morgan, reportedly by collecting an item he had discarded, and sent it for comparison against the crime scene profile. The results came back as a definitive match, tying 60-year-old Edward Morgan's DNA to the DNA found on Mary Jane Thompson's autopsy swabs. It was the evidence investigators needed to finally close the net around a suspect. In February 2022, Nearly 38 years to the day after Mary Jane's body was found, police arrested Edward Morgan and charged him in Thompson's case. Morgan, who had lived in Dallas for years, had never even been on the radar of the original investigation. Importantly, Morgan's DNA hadn't ever been in any criminal database, which explains why earlier searches never identified him. In the 1970s, Schenectady, New York, was a working-class town, home to families who built their lives around the massive General Electric plant. Among them were Mary Beth and Joseph Tinning, a young couple who, on the surface, seemed to be living an ordinary life. They married in 1965 and soon began to build a family, but their home would become the epicenter of a tragedy so relentless and so profound that it defied all explanation, earning the sympathy of an entire community. Over 14 years, a dark shadow fell over the Tinning household, and one by one, their 9 children perished. The cascade of loss was staggering. It began in 1972, a year of almost unimaginable grief. On January 3rd, their third child, Jennifer, died at just 8 days old from what doctors called hemorrhagic meningitis. Only 17 days later, 2-year-old Joseph Jr. was rushed to the hospital and pronounced dead on arrival, with the cause listed as cardiac arrest. Then, less than 2 months after that, on March 2nd, their firstborn child, 4-year-old Barbara, died after falling into a coma. Doctors attributed her death to an extremely rare condition known as Ray's syndrome. In the span of just 87 days, 3 of their children were gone, but the pattern didn't stop. The following year, their son Timothy was born, only to die 19 days later. His death was attributed to SIDS. In 1975, 5-month-old Nathan died from what an autopsy called acute pulmonary edema. In 1979, 3-month-old Mary Frances also died, another victim of supposed SIDS. A year later, 3-month-old Jonathan passed away, his cause of death undetermined. The community rallied around the Tinnings, viewing them as the victims of a cruel genetic lottery, a family cursed by a 1 in a billion medical anomaly. Mary Beth in particular became a figure of immense public sympathy, the grieving mother forced to endure the unendurable, burying one small casket after another. This narrative of tragedy was far more palatable than the alternative, an idea so monstrous it was almost impossible to contemplate, that the grieving mother was the curse herself. The shared belief in a medical tragedy created a powerful shield of denial, a collective psychological defense that allowed a predator to hide in plain sight. And beware, this may be one of the most disturbing stories you've ever heard, not just for the crime itself, but for the final outcome and where things stand today. Behind the public mask of the tragic victim was a woman whose life was built on a foundation of profound insecurity. Born in Duanesburg, New York, Mary Beth grew up feeling like an unwanted child, a sentiment she claimed a relative once told her directly. She would later claim that her parents hit her with a fly swatter and would lock her in a closet, though these allegations only came out much later. Of course, that's not to say they aren't true, but she only started making these claims when she was incentivized to do so. According to her, this upbringing instilled in her a deep-seated sense of worthlessness and a desperate, lifelong craving for attention and validation. Her marriage did little to fill this emotional void. She met Joseph Tinning on a blind date, and they married in 1965. And trust me when I say it, this guy is going to be a real unsung villain of this deeply disturbed story. Joseph was consistently described as a shy, passive, and emotionally inarticulate man who was unable to provide the support and intimacy Mary Beth craved. In 1974, during a period of intense marital turmoil, Mary Beth crushed prescription pills and put them in Joseph's grape juice. He was hospitalized with a near-fatal case of poisoning, yet he declined to press charges against his wife. Notably, for reasons which aren't clear to me, this incident didn't tip off the authorities to keep a closer eye on her as her children perished one by one. For nearly a decade, the genetic flaw theory provided a convenient, if tragic, explanation for the string of deaths in the Tinning family. It was a narrative that doctors, neighbors, and even law enforcement could accept. But in 1981, an event occurred that should have shattered that theory beyond repair. In 1978, the Tinnings had adopted a newborn son named Michael. As he wasn't their biological child, he couldn't have inherited any genetic disorder from them, which goes without saying. What's more important is that the odds of him being born with the exact same sort of issue that struck all their biological children ought to have been vanishingly low. Simply stated, his life should have been the definitive counter-evidence to the family curse, and an affirmation that this troubled couple didn't harm anyone. Instead, in March 1981, 3-year-old Michael died. Mary Beth brought his lifeless body to a doctor, claiming he simply wouldn't wake up. The official cause of death was listed as bronchial pneumonia. The death of a non-blood relative should have immediately triggered a full-scale investigation and a re-examination of all the previous deaths. It was a logical impossibility for an adopted child to die from his adoptive parent's genetic defect. Yet, inexplicably, no major investigation was launched. I'll just let that one sink in for a second. This catastrophic failure of oversight revealed the system was more invested in protecting its own prior conclusions than in responding to new, contradictory evidence. Notably, a number of physicians had raised suspicions and concerns and called for full inquiries, but were silenced. The system, in effect, chose to protect itself from the implications of its own past failures, and in doing so, it left Mary Beth Tinning free to strike again. The final act began on August 22, 1985, with the birth of Tammy Lynn, the Tinnings' 9th child. 4 months later, on December 20th, she was dead. This time, however, things were different. A formal investigation was finally launched. A laboratory test confirmed what should have been suspected all along. Tammy Lynn had died from asphyxia by suffocation. On February 4th, 1986, Mary Beth Tinning was brought in for questioning. She confessed to smothering Tammy Lynn with a pillow. She also admitted to eliminating 2 of her sons, Timothy and Nathan. Her reason was chillingly simple. They were crying, and their crying made her feel like an inadequate mother, so she shut them up permanently. This confession opened a window into a deeply disturbed mind, one that many experts now believe was afflicted with a rare disorder known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy. This is a condition where a caregiver secretly fabricates or induces illness in a person under their care to garner attention and sympathy for themselves. Tinning's life was a textbook profile. Her background as a nursing assistant and ambulance worker gave her a familiarity with medical settings. She reveled in the role of the tragic figure, becoming the center of attention for doctors, friends, and a sympathetic community. A pastor who had counseled her previously noted her profound lack of self-esteem and her constant, desperate attempts to gain acceptance. Mary Beth Tinning wasn't motivated by a simple desire to be free of her children. She was driven by a pathological addiction to the role of the grieving mother. The children themselves weren't necessarily even the targets of her rage, but the instruments she used to satisfy her desperate need for unlimited attention and sympathy. The legal system, faced with a case spanning over a decade with little remaining physical evidence, made a strategic decision. Prosecutors focused the case solely on the slaying of Tammy Lynn, for which they had a confession and forensic proof. While her admissions about the two other children were used to show intent, she was only tried for this one case. Her defense argued the confession was coerced, but in July 1987, a jury found her guilty, and she was sentenced to 20 years to life. For years, Tinning maintained her innocence. She was denied parole 6 times between 2007 and 2017. Finally, in July 2018, on her 7th attempt, a 75-year-old Marybeth Tinning was granted parole. She was released in August after serving over 30 years, a decision that was met with fury from politicians and the public, and basically anyone with a heart. The conclusion to her story is yet another extremely unsettling part of this twisted case, and it brings us back to her husband. Upon her release, Marybeth Tinning went home to live with her husband Joseph in their house in Duanesburg. This is the same man she once tried to eliminate, and a man who had his 9 children taken by this monster. Some have questioned if the authorities appropriately investigated the husband's potential involvement in the crimes of his wife, though there are no formal allegations against him. At present, Marybeth Tinning is still alive in that house, with that same spouse, in that house where all her children were slain. It was a performance that captivated and horrified a nation, and later the world. On October 25, 1994, a frantic 23-year-old mother from Union, South Carolina, told police a story that tapped into every parent's deepest fears. Susan Smith claimed that while stopped at a quiet intersection, a mysterious black male had forced her from her Mazda protege and sped away, taking her 2 small sons with him. For 9 agonizing days, America watched as Susan made tearful televised pleas for the safe return of 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex. Her face, etched with what looked like unbearable grief, became a fixture on the evening news. The images of her 2 smiling boys were flashed across every screen, and a wave of national sympathy poured into the small southern town as a massive manhunt got underway. The story was a perfect storm of tragedy: innocent children, a distraught mother, and a dangerous, shadowy figure. It was a narrative the public readily consumed, a heartbreaking drama playing out in real time. But the twist was that it was all a lie. The supposed perpetrator that Susan Smith created was both specific and chillingly generic: a black man in a knit cap. Little did the public know, the true perpetrator was the one standing before them, live on TV. While the nation was swept up in the emotional tide of the case, investigators were quietly applying cold logic to Susan Smith's story. From almost the very beginning, her account raised red flags for law enforcement. Detectives were skeptical within the first 2 days, finding it peculiar that a carjacker, whose primary goal is stealing a vehicle, would complicate the crime by taking 2 small children. Their suspicions were strong enough that they began searching nearby lakes and ponds, including John D. Long Lake, long before Smith confessed. She was subjected to a polygraph test just 2 days into the investigation, which she failed, further cementing their doubts. The critical flaw in her story, the detail that would ultimately shatter her entire fabrication, was mundane and technical. Smith claimed she was stopped at a red light at an otherwise empty intersection behind a local textile mill. Investigators, however, discovered that the traffic light at that specific location was operated by a pressure plate on the intersecting road. It wouldn't have turned red for Smith unless another vehicle was present to trigger it. Her insistence that no other cars were around made her story a physical impossibility. This single, unassailable fact exposed the foundation of her lie. While the country was focused on the high drama of a kidnapping, the case was being cracked by the simple mechanics of a traffic signal. After 9 days of mounting pressure and intensifying scrutiny, the deception collapsed. On November 3rd, 1994, investigators confronted Smith with the inconsistencies in her story. Union County Sheriff Howard Wells employed a strategic bluff, telling her they had surveillance footage of the intersection that proved she was lying. The weight of her secret, combined with this final push, was too much to bear. Smith broke down, dropping to her knees in a fit of hysterical crying, and finally confessed to the unthinkable. There was no carjacker. There was no kidnapping. She had eliminated her own children. She admitted that she had driven her Mazda to a boat ramp at John D. Long Lake, a quiet wooded spot just outside of town. With Michael and Alex still strapped into their car seats in the back, she got out, released the emergency brake, and let the car roll down the incline and into the dark water. Divers were dispatched to the lake and, after a search, located the vehicle submerged in 18 feet of water, much farther from the shore than they had initially expected. The scene inside the car was heartbreaking. The bodies of the two little boys were found dangling upside down in their car seats, one of their tiny hands forever pressed against a window. The confession transformed Smith from a figure of national sympathy into one of profound public contempt, a woman who would become one of America's most hated mothers. The subsequent trial in 1995 presented two starkly different portraits of Susan Smith, forcing the jury and the public to grapple with the complex question of her motive. The prosecution painted her as a selfish and manipulative woman who committed this act for a man. They argued that Smith was desperate to continue a relationship with Tom Findlay, the wealthy son of her boss, who had recently sent her a letter ending their affair. In that letter, Findlay had made it clear that he wasn't ready for a family and didn't want children. The prosecution contended that Smith saw her sons as the primary obstacle to the life and relationship she craved, and she made a horrific choice to eliminate them. In stark contrast, her defense team argued that this was not a case about evil, but one of despair and sadness. They presented a devastating portrait of a life marked by profound trauma and untreated mental illness. The jury heard about her dark history of trauma as a child, and psychiatrists testified that she suffered from major depression and a dependent personality disorder. The defense's theory was that Smith had driven to the lake that night, intending to end the entire family. However, in a final panicked moment, her body had literally willed itself out of the car as it rolled toward the water. When that's your defense, I think it's pretty safe to say you're beyond cooked. In July 1995, after deliberating for only 2.5 hours, the jury found Susan Smith guilty, to the surprise of no one. The prosecution passionately argued that she should be condemned, suggesting it would have been the expected verdict against the fictional black carjacker she created if he did it. They also noted that she had used the carjacker's supposed race to appeal to the prejudice of the public and the authorities, marking that as an aggravating factor. However, the defense's portrayal of her traumatic life was compelling enough to spare her. The jury sentenced her to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Her time in prison has been troubled, marked by disciplinary issues including drug use and illicit relationships with prison guards. On November 20th, 2024, 30 years after her crimes, Smith appeared via video for her first parole hearing. In a tearful plea, she said she was sorry and that God had forgiven her. I suppose I'm reminded of that famous executioner's sword from medieval Germany that's engraved with a line that says, "When he lifts the sword, he wishes for eternal life for the sinner." What I'm saying is that I hate when I hear this sort of language. It's just a pure attempt by a sick individual to try to manipulate emotions. Unsurprisingly, her so-called remorse wasn't enough. Her ex-husband David was there to speak for the sons he lost, and the parole board unanimously denied her release. On the morning of June 20th, 2001, a 911 dispatcher in Houston, Texas, received a call from a woman named Andrea Yates. Her voice was eerily calm as she repeatedly requested a police officer, but refused to explain why. When officers arrived at her suburban home, they found a scene of unimaginable horror. Inside, Andrea confessed immediately, telling them 4 of her children, John, age 5, Paul, 3, Luke, 2, and Mary, 6 months, were laid out on a bed in the master bedroom. Her eldest son, 7-year-old Noah, was still in the bathtub, floating face down. In the span of a single hour, between her husband leaving for work and her mother-in-law's expected arrival, Andrea had systematically drowned all 5 of her children. The act was methodical, deliberate, and so profoundly disturbing that it immediately seized the nation's attention. However, the true story of what happened is even more disturbing than you can possibly imagine. Despite the unimaginable horror that occurred, this wasn't an unexpected event by any means. It's a tale of an all-gas, no-brakes descent into madness, where all the guardrails seem to completely fail for both Andrea and her kids. Before she became a household name for the most tragic of reasons, Andrea had once been the picture of success. Born in Houston on July 2nd, 1964, she excelled in her youth, graduating as the valedictorian of her high school class and serving as captain of the swim team. She went on to earn a degree in nursing and worked as a highly regarded registered nurse at a Houston cancer center. In 1993, she married Rusty Yates, a NASA engineer, and soon after the birth of their first child in 1994, she left her career to become a full-time, homeschooling mother. The family's life was shaped by a deep commitment to a Christian ideology that emphasized having as many children as nature allowed. They lived for a time in unconventional settings, including a travel trailer and a converted bus, which contributed to a growing sense of isolation. Their beliefs were heavily influenced by the teachings of an itinerant preacher named Michael Waroniecki, who corresponded with the family. His sermons, which they consumed through letters and videos, preached that sinful mothers were doomed to raise sinful children who would go to hell. This doctrine appears to have intersected catastrophically with Andrea's developing mental illness, feeding a growing belief that she was a bad mother. This in turn meant that her children were consequently going to go to hell because of her personal failures. Andrea's descent into psychosis wasn't sudden, but a slow, agonizing unraveling that began years before the tragedy. She later reported having her first psychotic episode after the birth of her first son, Noah, in 1994, seeing visions of Satan but telling no one for fear the devil would harm her children. Her illness escalated dramatically after the birth of her 4th son, Luke, in 1999. That year, she attempted to end it all twice. These attempts led to her first psychiatric hospitalizations. During her time there, she was diagnosed with major depressive disorder with psychotic features, as well as postpartum psychosis. A devastating cycle began. She would be hospitalized, show rapid improvement on antipsychotic medication, and then be discharged, only to go off her medications. Doctors explicitly warned the couple that having more children would almost certainly trigger another, more severe psychotic episode. Despite these warnings, the couple conceived their 5th child just weeks after one of her hospital discharges. The birth of their daughter, Mary, in November 2000, followed by the sudden death of Andrea's father in March 2001, sent her into her final catastrophic breakdown. She became nearly catatonic, stopped eating, and read the Bible feverishly. Her delusions became all-consuming. She believed television cameras were monitoring her mothering, and believed Satan had entered her body. Most critically, she became convinced that her children were not developing righteously and were doomed to burn in hell because she had ruined them. Just weeks before the events, her psychiatrist discontinued her antipsychotic medication due to side effects, a decision that proved to be a fatal turning point. Andrea Yates's case resulted in two separate trials with two starkly different outcomes that revealed just how subjective the legal definition of insanity can be. In the first trial in 2002, prosecutors sought to give this mother an appointment with the chair. The case hinged on Texas's strict insanity law, which requires a defendant to prove they did not know their conduct was wrong. The prosecution argued that Andrea's methodical planning, waiting for her husband to leave, drowning the children one by one, proved she knew it was wrong. The defense countered that her severe psychosis made her believe her actions were not only right, but morally necessary to save her children from eternal damnation. They acknowledged that this was an extremely disturbing situation, but they claimed that in her mental framework, this was all very real. The trial took a decisive turn with the testimony of the prosecution's star expert witness, forensic psychiatrist Dr. Park Dietz. He told the jury that an episode of the show Law and Order, featuring a woman who drowned her children and was acquitted by reason of insanity, had aired shortly before the crime. The prosecution seized on this, suggesting in closing arguments that Andrea had mimicked the show to create a legal defense. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding her guilty on all offenses. However, the story wasn't over. It was later discovered that this doctor's testimony was false, and no such Law and Order episode had ever aired. It's not even that a similar episode had aired at some point, it was that no such episode ever existed at all. In an age where you couldn't fact-check testimony in real time, her defense team apparently didn't realize this was false. That said, I'm going to criticize the defense harshly here regardless, because they didn't challenge the fact that the episode of the show wasn't entered into evidence. The prosecution, of course, ought to have disclosed this episode to the defense prior to the trial as well, if their expert intended to rely upon this evidence. I can't quite imagine that something so important to a case wasn't fully investigated by the prosecutors. In 2005, a Texas appeals court overturned the conviction, ruling that the false testimony was material and could have improperly influenced the jury. This paved the way for a retrial in 2006. The second trial was different in crucial ways. In the intervening years, extensive media coverage had also led to a national conversation about postpartum psychosis, creating a more informed public. With largely the same psychiatric evidence presented, the second jury deliberated for 13 hours and reached the opposite conclusion. Andrea Yates was not guilty by reason of insanity. Now, importantly, this doesn't mean what many people think it means. In fact, in many cases, insanity can lead to a much longer time essentially locked up. Following the 2006 verdict, Andrea Yates was committed to a state mental health facility. She was first sent to a high-security forensic psychiatric ward, and later, in 2007, to the lower-security Kerrville State Hospital. According to reports, she is now consistently medicated, and her attorney describes her as a woman who deeply grieves for her children. She has consistently waived her right to the annual hearings that could lead to her release. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here reminding you to subscribe and hit the notification bell and turn on all those notifications. Also, if you feel like tossing a clam or two in my bucket, click the join link or the Patreon link in the description. With that said, let's get back to business. In the quiet, rolling hills of upstate New York, a young couple named Juanetta and Tim Hoyt were living through an unimaginable nightmare. Between 1965 and 1971, they buried 5 of their children. First came Eric, then James and Julie, followed by Molly and Noah. One by one, they were laid to rest, each death a fresh wave of grief that left their small community heartbroken. For more than 20 years, their story was a medical tragedy, a case study in the cruel randomness of a newly understood condition. But a single decades-old medical paper held a clue to a different, more horrifying truth. This truth that would eventually reveal their story wasn't one of a tragic medical mystery at all. The pattern of death in the Hoyt household was as relentless as it was heartbreaking. It began in January 1965, when their firstborn, Eric, died at just 3 months old. 2 more children followed: James, born in 1966, and Julie, born in 1968. In September 1968, tragedy struck twice in 3 weeks. First, 48-day-old Julie died, and then 28-month-old James followed. 2 more children, Molly and Noah, were born in 1970 and 1971, respectively. Both also died within a few months of their birth. In each case, the cause of death was listed as SIDS, a diagnosis that, at the time, was shrouded in mystery and fear. Hoyt's crimes unfolded during a unique moment in medical history. The term was only formally introduced in 1969, following years of varied and often incorrect theories about why seemingly healthy infants perished in their sleep. It was a diagnosis of exclusion, applied when a thorough investigation and autopsy could find no other explanation. This lack of definitive knowledge created a diagnostic fog. For grieving parents, it offered a non-blaming explanation for an unbearable loss. For a predator like Juanetta Hoyt, however, it provided the perfect cover. Her crimes coincided precisely with the period when the medical community had just enough knowledge to name the phenomenon, but not enough to distinguish it from a covert slaying. The Hoyt family's tragedy was so profound that it attracted the attention of Dr. Alfred Steinschneider, a pediatrician at Upstate Medical Center in Syracuse. The last 2 Hoyt babies, Molly and Noah, became subjects in his study. Juanita reported that the infants suffered from breathing difficulties, and they were admitted to the hospital for monitoring. Molly even became the first baby in the United States to be sent home with an apnea monitor. Despite this, both children perished shortly after being discharged. In October 1972, Dr. Steinschneider published his findings in the journal Pediatrics. The paper, which referred to the Hoyts only as Family H, proposed that SIDS could be caused by prolonged apnea and that this condition might run in families. The 5 Hoyt deaths served as the tragic proof of his hypothesis. The truth remained buried until 1985, when a prosecutor from a neighboring county, William Fitzpatrick, was working on an unrelated case with similar facts. He consulted with Dr. Linda Norton, a forensic pathologist from Dallas, who reviewed Steinschneider's 1972 paper. She saw something different in the data, not a medical anomaly, but a pattern of a predator. She gave Fitzpatrick a chilling warning. He might have a serial perpetrator in his area. The warning stayed with Fitzpatrick. When he was elected district attorney in 1992, he used his new authority to track down the anonymous Family H. He sent the case files to Dr. Michael Baden, a renowned forensic pathologist with the New York State Police. After reviewing the medical records and the autopsies of the exhumed remains, the physician's conclusion was unequivocal. Juanetta Hoyt was a monster. In March 1994, investigators made their move. A state trooper who knew Juanita approached her at a post office and, using a clever ruse, he invited her to participate in a quote-unquote new research project on mothers who had been affected by SIDS. She agreed. During the subsequent interrogation, the friendly facade dropped, and under questioning, Juanetta Hoyt confessed. She admitted to everything, and her motive was both shockingly simple and profoundly evil. The babies wouldn't stop crying, and she wanted to silence them. She described her methods in chilling detail, admitting she had used pillows, a bath towel, and the pressure of her own shoulder to smother them. Almost immediately, however, she recanted, claiming her confession was coerced. The validity of that confession became the central issue of her trial. The defense hired a forensic psychologist who concluded that Hoyt's dependent and avoidant personality disorders made her uniquely vulnerable to manipulative police tactics. Then, in a stunning development, even the prosecution's own psychiatric expert agreed that she was vulnerable and the police had manipulated her. The 1995 trial pitted two eras of science against each other. The prosecution, led by Fitzpatrick, built its case on Baden's modern forensic analysis and Hoyt's detailed confession. The defense countered with Dr. Steinschneider, who stood by his original SIDS diagnosis and argued that the confession was worthless. Prosecutors also speculated that Hoyt may have been suffering from Munchausen syndrome by proxy. This was a then-emerging psychological disorder in which a parent gains attention and sympathy through fabricated medical issues with a child. In April 1995, a jury found Winetta Hoyt guilty, and she was sentenced to 75 years to life in prison. But the story had one final bizarre twist. In August 1998, Hoyt died of pancreatic cancer before her appeal could be heard. Under New York law, because she died with her appeal still pending, her conviction was formally vacated. While a jury had declared her guilty, her legal record was officially wiped clean. Just dropping in once more, reminding you to share this video, subscribe, and check out my other content. Until next time, peace out.